White House 2020. Ed Blakely is a former Washington insider, an internationally recognised leader in urban development and planning, advisor, author, and one of the two hosts on this podcast. My name is Sean Britton from the radio station 2SER. Ed, we're less than 2 weeks out from the big day. It's been a long road, but as tired of it as we might feel, I don't think America is taking it for granted. More than 35 million Americans have voted already, on track for a record early turnout. What's been going on?
Well, that's 35 million who've gone to a polling place or handed in their ballots. It doesn't count all their warehouses and mail. A lot of Democrats have voted by mail, and in some cases, they will not be counted. Those ballots will not be counted until the day after the election in some states. That doesn't matter in California, but it sure matters in Pennsylvania. And by the way, the Supreme Court got in the act already in Pennsylvania. Lower courts, the lower Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, I should say the highest Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, is allowing anything that's postmarked on the day of the election to be counted up to 10 days after the election. Now, why does this matter? It matters for overseas voters like myself. If I send my ballot in and get it on the date of the election, and that means I'd have to send it a day earlier here, and it goes all the way to the United States, it might be 7 or 8 days before it gets there, and that vote would be counted. Luckily, I don't live in Pennsylvania, or unlucky for Biden. I live in California. But this is a big one, and it shows another thing. That was a 4-4 tie, which meant it went back to the lower court and gave the Democrats the victory. Had Amy been there, it could have been the other way. So the Supreme Court does matter. I should do my Supreme song, but not now.
Tomorrow is the final presidential debate, exactly 24 hours away, in fact. And at time of recording, Donald Trump is still attending, in spite of the fact that the debate will be virtual with muted microphones in between questions, which would completely destroy Trump's strategy from debate number one.
Again, I think it'll be difficult for him. I didn't know there'd be that much distance in it. I haven't been following it that closely. I just knew about the muted microphones. But if there's physical difference between them, it's going to be very difficult for Trump, because you notice how when he's in front of a crowd, his behavior is very, very different. So he's much more muted when he's out there by himself. And all of his interviews with hosts, NBC, Fox News, and so on, have fallen flat. He even stopped a 60-minute interview because without somebody to play to, he is not good. And I think even if they're in the same room with muting of mics and so on, where he can't climb over his candidate, he will not be as good. At this juncture, it probably doesn't make any difference.
As you say, Ed, he's very comfortable in front of a crowd. And after skipping the second debate, Trump has essentially retreated to his favorite feel-good arena, which is the Trump rallies. There's a lot we can unpack coming from these, including, the thousands of his supporters packing in the midst of a pandemic in with a man.
Are we sure
ill?
The Grateful Dead types that go from Wisconsin to Pennsylvania? Those are driving distance. You can drive most of those in 4 or 5 hours. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of those people, particularly in the Midwest, aren't the same people at each rally.
Well, it's your last chance, isn't it? It's sort of it's a farewell tour, you would almost hope.
And you noticed in Arizona and Nevada, those crowds were much smaller and more compact. I think the bigger crowds, except for Florida, are people coming from multiple states.
One of the lines of attack he used at one of these rallies on Joe Biden. It did raise a few eyebrows this week, saying Biden will listen to scientists if he's elected president,
What a
which
scary thought.
it's a confusing. I mean, it says to me, not just about Trump, it says to me a lot about sort of American anti-intellectualism as a whole.
No, it doesn't. This is the first time in U.S. history. No, it isn't. No, I forget the Scopes trial back in 1800s, that Americans have not overwhelmingly taken the advice of scientists. The U.S. Scientific community is very tight, very independent, and its advice counts. The best example of that is the CDC. Until this debacle with Trump, what the CDC said was gospel to Americans. The same thing's true in all the other scientific arenas, space flight. So science is kind of worshipped in the United States. In the US, usually in the Nobel Prizes, turns out the most scientists, and the best and most revered universities are science universities, including its agricultural universities. I think Trump is going to the base who did not go to university and who feel science and everything is rigged against them. And if we cover the attempted assassination of the Michigan governor, which raised her in the polls, that's all about people feeling they were not able to get into universities. So scientists, academics, all those people are against them.
Another popular line of attack has been these shots at Hunter Biden. Trump bagman Rudy Giuliani shopped around this story that eventually found a home at the New York Post. Even the Post's muckraker wouldn't put his name to the story. Even Fox News wouldn't take this story that claimed Hunter was a middleman for Joe and a Ukrainian energy executive. Now, this story seems to have backfired, if anything. It is very, very transparent. But the GOP are desperately trying to manufacture a repeat of the Clinton email scandal of 2016. What do you make of their efforts, Ed?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at Trump's campaign, it's the 2016 campaign. It is not a 2020 campaign. He's trying to replicate what he did before. So he's going back to the same playbook. This is much like the teams that win a championship in any sport using the same tactics that used in the past to win again, and it usually doesn't work because the defense has improved, and the defense has improved with the Democrats. Throwing mud on the wall isn't working because the person they're throwing the mud at doesn't have any mud on his hands. His son is not a candidate for president. And if I were Biden and start talking about my sons, I'd start bringing up the president's sons who've been indicted for tax fraud, who've been indicted for running false charities, who've been indicted for defrauding of the campaign, the Trump campaign, the inauguration, whose daughter got $75,000 paid to her for consulting for fill in the blank. So there's a little bit of dirt on that side of the house too.
Again, sort of looking at COVID-19, and I think, again, this sort of switches back to the what we were talking about in terms of the anti-science agenda in the Trump campaign. He's escalated attacks on Anthony Fauci, really the face of the ignored scientific response to COVID, claiming the US would have had 500,000 deaths by now if they'd listened to Fauci instead of the 220,000 very real, actual deaths they've had listening to Trump. Is there any value in this, trying to shift the narrative on COVID in this way, Ed?
Is he going to go after Mother Teresa next? Fauci is the most popular man in the United States, bar none. He says it like it is. He's rare in the ability to communicate with people at every age very well. He's Mr. Rogers. This backfired on him too, because even his own people said, shouldn't go there. So this just shows the desperation. He's out of money, he's out of time, and he's out of games he can play.
While we're on this one, what's happening with financial stimulus? Nancy Pelosi laid down the law earlier this week with a 48-hour deadline to reach a deal. And what are we seeing?
Well, let's go back to the numbers. The Dems wanted $2 trillion. It's whittled down to 1.8 that the Dems would settle for if the provisions were exactly the same as the Dems wanted. That is, money for first responders, money for states to undergird their economies again, money for small business, money for individuals in the extension of the unemployment insurance, and money for schools and other institutions trying to adapt to COVID. The Trump deal was money for farmers because he wants to win Iowa and Nebraska and farm states. So most of the money was going to go to farmers and big and medium-sized businesses because these are the people who were putting money in his campaign. So this was a difference in the 1.8. Just this week, Trump threw up his hands and said, anything will do, because he's reading the polls. You don't have to be reading tea leaves here. People are suffering and they want something. They're beginning to blame Pelosi, which Trump thinks is good. But if he doesn't come up with something, the blame will fall on both sides and it won't help him. There is something that needs to be done. Will it be done? No, because the GOP Senate doesn't want to spend more than $500 million, almost entirely on medium and big sized businesses, and none to people. Now, if this is not a recipe for the Senate to be drummed out of town, I don't know what is. I would have given away everything if they'd vote for me. And now senators are jumping ship and say, oh, it's not me, it's not me, it's not me. They can't even get up a quorum to hear a bill. It's very sad, sad for millions of Americans.
There is still news going on in the world at the moment outside of the elections. Just looking at what's going on, Sudan, Trump is looking to remove Sudan from a list of countries that sponsor terrorism as long as it completes payment of a settlement to victims of terrorist attacks. Now, some believe this could be leading to improved relations with Israel. Any thoughts, Ed?
Well, it's just another gimmick. Sudan doesn't have any capacity to do any danger to anybody at this point. The country is really in very bad shape. It's just south of Egypt and Israel. And so saying something, these are kind of fruitless gestures. They make big press, but there's no substance. This is the door, but not the whole house. So this is a 30-second headline. And maybe they think it'll get a few Sudanese voters. But people who are smart enough to move from Sudan aren't going for this trick.
And a new deal between the US and Russia to freeze numbers of nuclear warheads could be in the offing, following on from Trump's rejection of the New START Pact earlier this year. What's going on? Is Russia tossing Trump a last big foreign policy win before the election?
Well, Russia doesn't really want to expand its nuclear arsenal. And the reason for that, it has so much territory to cover and so many different places to deliver its weapons. It has plenty of weapons now. And so they don't want to put more weapons in Turkestan and places like that. On the United States side, apparently, and Trump does accidentally tell the truth at times, the US nuclear arsenal is very sophisticated now, and weapons can be delivered from almost anywhere by guidance systems that don't require pilots. That means these are basically missile guided nuclear weapons. In the face of that, the Russians say, oops, let's back down a bit. We're winning where we want to in the economic war. We'll play with the Chinese. We'll capture the seas. We don't want to be in Afghanistan and stuff like this. Russian people are going hungry. This is not a big deal. It may make Trump look good. Let's at least say the right things. And I think the Russian generals really want this.
And again, less than 2 weeks out from the election, we've spoken about voter suppression and these extraordinary lines in some places. Trump's poll watchers included this week a cop reprimanded for wearing a Trump face mask in a polling booth, and a poll watcher fired for turning away voters in Black Lives Matter shirts. Look, Ed, as you know, I've got a long-standing fascination, an appreciation for America, the way the sometimes lofty, noble goals of the nation don't always translate to reality. And I've got to say, nothing really makes me sicker than seeing these assaults on democracy in this election. It really does make me sick. Any other issues we're seeing?
Yes, but let's look at this a slightly different way. This was going on for nearly 100 years.
Of course.
People were hanged if they went to vote. It wasn't until Martin Luther King that voter suppression really came into the forefront. Blacks just didn't go to the polls in the South. There was only one Black member of Congress when I was a kid from New York, because the lines had been drawn in every state so that Blacks could not get in. So we've gone a long, long way where CNN or MSNBC or whomever can report this stuff. And what is really interesting to me to see both Republican and Democratic directors of election or chairs of elections going to the lengths they're going to make sure this election is fair. So the people who are doing the good job are the people who are running the elections. I've been very impressed when they've been interviewed, Republicans and Democrats, that they're going to see that every voter who does the right thing has the right to vote. And the reason this is all coming to light is because of them. They're firing these people. They're making note of it. So this is a new day. Let me add something else to this. In the polls, it shows Biden down 1% or ahead 2% in places like Georgia and Texas. There are new voters in Georgia and Texas that aren't being polled. You can see that with Beto O'Rourke. He came within a whisker of beating Ted Cruz. Those voters are still around and they still haven't been counted. Let's look for, in Georgia, in North Carolina, and in Texas, the potential for some surprises. If Texas goes to Biden, the Republican Party better kiss it goodbye.
And just before we move off this one, though, there is also the report that's come out this week regarding Russia and Iran meddling in the election. Some voters are receiving quite threatening emails, essentially saying, vote Trump, we know where you live. What do you make of this one, Ed?
Boy, that's probably inciting them to go out and vote
You
for
would hope.
Biden. So keep it up, guys. Iran is doing just the opposite. They want Biden in because they'd like to get that treaty back. I think they may cancel one another out. The other thing is the FBI has been on television, on every network, on radio and so forth, letting people know this is going on. Again, this did not happen 30, 40, 50 years ago. Even in the face of Trump's threats to these people, they're doing the right thing, including saving the governor of Michigan. And Trump could not take any credit for that. It was the FBI working for the American people.
Mm. And just a last word on the Supreme Court. There are big fears, of course, that they will pull behind Trump in any disagreement over procedures in the next election. You mentioned, of course, at the very top, there was the 4-4 ruling in this week in the case brought by the Pennsylvania Republicans. They were challenging that ruling you mentioned in their state court, which said they must accept the mail ballots received up to 3 days after the election. Now, that was a win for Democrats. But if Amy Coney Barrett is added to the court, well, there's no stretch to imagine where she'd fall on a case that could decide the continuation of the Trump presidency. There's not much to be done about it, I guess, but any thoughts, Ed?
Well, I still have this funny feeling in my stomach that she may not be as bad as we think. I can't imagine her coming from the background she comes from, voting against the Affordable Care Act. She might piece it a little bit, but I think she's going to come down on the side of it. The other thing is, I think she knows Roberts and she can be schooled by Roberts. She doesn't owe much to Trump at all, or the Republican Party. If you look at all of her rulings, many more of them have been on the areas of narrow interpretations of the rules rather than broad reinterpretations of the rules. So she's bad, but I can imagine worse. So in election, she's probably going to defer, if she's a constitutionalist, to the states, because election law is state law, not federal law.
Ed, this is why I enjoy speaking to you every week. You are an eternal optimist. It does make me feel a little bit better about the future of the country, mate. We'll be back on it next week.
Oh yes, and let's hope we have some good news.